Welcome to Speaking of Excellence, the official podcast of the Quality Professionals Awards. In this episode, we're going to go beyond policies and procedures to explore how organisations build a culture where compliance is simply second nature. We ask what it takes to create an environment where compliance isn't seen as a chore, but part of the DNA of a thriving organisation, and where in that process we can find the elements of engagement, empowerment, and even fun. To help us unpack this, your host Lou Doyle is joined by a panel of guests who bring a wealth of experience in embedding compliance into organisational culture. Heather Collins is from London South Bank University. Joe McCormack joins us from Education Partnership North East. We have Paul Rogers from WS Training and Alisha Burke from NCFE. So let's dive in.
Heather, if I come to you first, tell us about the role that you've got now and how on earth you ended up there.
I'm Head of Apprenticeship Implementation and Compliance at London South Bank University. I worked in an FE college for 13 years as a curriculum manager. I actually joined LSBU at the beginning, really, of their journey when we had a couple of hundred apprentices. And initially, I went for a year, now 7 years. I'm still at LSBU. So my journey has been about how to introduce processes and systems that we've managed to deal with our growth and stay compliant. So it's a lot different looking after a couple of hundred apprentices to 3,500 apprentices. And that's working with my team, is making sure that the compliance is embedded in everything we do. And a lot's been around educating people on the joys of the funding rules and how we have to make our journey, although compliant, making sure it's the best for the apprentices and their employers, and always having in the back of our minds Ofsted, audits, all those other things that comes with having a funded provision.
Thank you, Heather. Paul, let me come to you. Tell us a little bit about how you got to where you got to and why compliance is important in your world.
So my job at WS Training is head of compliance and data systems. I've been there for about 4 years now. It's a part-time job that I do, and it's all remote-based that I do with them. And I joined that through during COVID. And it was a time where they'd had a long-standing compliance person there, and they were moving on, and they needed a bit of a fresh perspective. They couldn't find it, and they chose me. So that was the answer. At which point, we've completely tried to destroy the concepts of compliance that were embedded in the organisation, started from scratch and rebuilt it from the beginnings, with a culture of actually saying that everything along the journey should be compliance checked as it goes, instead of this situation of just doing it at the end or at midpoints. So we flipped it around that nothing actually needs to be spot checked as such. It's all that everything is checked as we go in the journey. And then we can be assured that things are 100% accurate even before it becomes a problem. Aside to that, I work part-time because then I work with other providers. So the last 4 years have been a whirlwind for me in understanding how so many different other providers work. And I think they benefit from the honest reaction they get from me on whether I think something's right or something's wrong, or give them the assurance that's needed.
Thank you, Paul. Alisha, let me turn to you. Tell us about you.
So I'm the data protection business partner at NCFE, and I have been for about a year now. I started at NCFE after I graduated uni, so I've been with NCFE for about 7 years now. And I've always kind of sat in a compliance role. I was in quality assurance for a while, looking after our external quality assurers and the quality assurance of the business. And then I moved to compliance just after COVID and worked in the compliance team around malpractice and maladministration investigations, and then kind of fell into risk and data protection because we were bringing in a new system and we completely refreshed our way of working around risk. And then decided that data protection was more my bag, and we're kind of increasing the visibility of data protection and the compliance of data protection, and we're trying to make it fun, as much as data protection can be fun, and changing the way that people think about it. And we are also adopting that kind of think about it from the beginning perspective and look at it all the way through, rather than thinking about it at the end and getting an email and somebody says, "Oh, I didn't really do this, Alisha, I'm sorry." And we're changing that to, let's think about the person and the data from the beginning and work out what we can do to make that as safe and secure as possible as we go through the journey of what we're doing in all of our processes at NCFE.
Thank you, Alisha. Alisha, in her introduction, manages to get two things that no one expected. Number one, falling into data protection, and number two, making it fun. So who would have thought that's where we would end up so quickly in the conversation? I'm looking forward to coming back to you on that as well. Jo, last but of course not least, tell us a bit about yourself.
So I'm Associate Principal for MIS Education Partnership North East. I've nearly been with the company for 4 years. It'll be 4 years on the 1st of March, started in COVID, like Paul. Prior to that, I've done lots of varied jobs, but probably getting into data, I worked for a private company in forecast planning. So it got into data and then went into teaching lower level IT user stuff for a further education college. I moved into a quality manager role, so doing some of the data for the self-assessment and the annex tables at the back, and then moved into managing the Department for Data Services in a further education college, which encompassed systems and exams, but on a much smaller scale than Education Partnership North East. And then I fancied a challenge and moved to working for a group. So I've been here, as I say, nearly 4 years. It's been a challenge, but a good challenge, the right decision to make. And there's been a lot to do, still is a lot to do. But yeah, that's me.
It never ends. It never ends. Start us off, Jo, by giving us your view on what do we mean when we talk about creating a culture of compliance.
A culture of compliance, it should be embedded into everybody's daily routine. It shouldn't feel like it's something additional to do. It should be the norm of every day's work. And I think everybody needs to understand their purpose and their role and what they're doing. And I think if we do it, then everything should just fall into place, apart from, new procedures, funding guidance that we've got to work towards and adapt. But if everybody's compliant and it's built into the role, it reduces the risk, and it promotes college integrity, and it makes for a happier workforce. And it's not a them and us culture, because it can be a little bit curriculum and business supporter at loggerheads, where we all need to work together and understand each other's roles. And I think in doing that then helps with sustainability, it helps with the reputation, it helps with the success of the college, and we all work together with the same goal.
Yeah, I was just saying it's quite tricky sometimes trying to persuade people that it's not just a tick box exercise and that everything we do is for a reason. And then I think making sure that what we do is robust and it's got that quality and it's got that depth about it. So we are ticking many boxes as we go along, but it's not just for the sake of it. There's a purpose, and to me the purpose is always the student, the apprentice, the employer, and making sure then that we're not at risk of losing or any clawbacks. I think for us it's the culture of always explaining and trying to educate people, this is why we do it, but there is often a lot of bureaucracy that we have to work through and things we have to do, which it'd make our lives a lot easier if we didn't have to, but it's part of the rules, isn't it? It's what we have to do to remain compliant.
It's trying to remove the worry that people are sitting thinking about what they're doing and what they're not doing and how that makes them non-compliant or whether they are definitely compliant. It should just be the basic standard that we're setting, and then when that basic standard's set, then you can introduce the culture, because everybody's working from the same premise and everybody has the same objective of it's a basic standard, and then we strive for better than what is compliant.
Paul, let me turn to you on that. So that idea that these guys have started to pick up on about misconceptions around what compliance is. Give us your spin on that, and let's take it from there.
I mean, one of the things is that it's when you make the association of the word compliance with other things. And it's like there's always this bias where you think that the reason we do compliance is purely for financial reasons, and it's purely so that we keep the money. Well, the hard reality of it is that we're in an environment where we access public funds, public government money, and therefore with every single thing that happens, there are rules and caveats that apply. And you can debate the whole reasons for it, and that's one of the misconceptions, that people will challenge it all the time. But these are decisions that have been made and rules that have been put in place for a certain reason, and maybe we don't know the full reason as to why that's in play, but they have to be enforced because there's been some issue somewhere along the way that needs to be monitored. So I think it's about, one of the misconceptions is thinking it's that the issues are all aimed at an individual or at a certain thing. It's not. It's about the wider picture. There's a journey that everybody goes on, and that's why you're doing it. I think one of the other things is that it's not just about the paperwork either. There are these other things. Compliance does foster things like, you've got the financial element, you've got the delivery element, you've got the quality assurance and quality improvement element. It's about taking pride in what you're doing. And I think I challenge anyone to actually say, if you saw something that's blatantly wrong with data or something, why would you just sit there and let it carry on? It's everyone's responsibility to do something about it in just the same guise as you would with safeguarding or anything else. Every member of staff has a responsibility to say, that doesn't look right, it needs to be fixed. And it's okay to have a conversation about it as well. That's one of the main things. The other thing is that there's this misconception that compliance is only one department. It's like, oh, it's the compliance team, they're going on about it again. It's not, it's a collective. It's like they are finding things. They shouldn't be there to actually find and rectify. They're there to recommend and say, look, this part of the department needs to pull their act together. They need to look at what's going on, and they need to improve what's doing. So we can all aspire to get to that outstanding grade or that wonderful vision of no clawback that might exist. It's a team effort. I think one of the other misconceptions is that it's okay to make mistakes. Nobody is perfect. I mean, if we were, we wouldn't have funding rules that change all the time and guidance that changes all the time. It adapts, it evolves. And there's this strange misconception that people think that auditors are not human sometimes when they come in and check things. I mean, to some extent, there were some that argue that could be the case, but they do generally have a common sense and pragmatic approach. So they do try and understand what's going on and determine if something is an isolated issue or whether it's, a systemic issue that's going on. And that's the thing to understand, the risk mitigation, lowering it is more important than actually worrying about the one error that might exist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. It makes perfect sense. It's quite interesting the angle that they come at it from. But it's that point of, those various points all of you have made, which is it's not just one person's job. It sits across the entire organisation. It's actually not just within a particular lane. So it's not just about funding. There are other things like data protection that we have to think about, like safeguarding. So actually, if you try and box compliance off into any one of those lanes, you create greater risk in other areas of the business or the organisation because people aren't looking at those things as being compliance related. Is it possible for an organisation to deliver high quality provision, whatever that is, if they have an issue with compliance?
On the curriculum side, yes, they probably could deliver that, but because they might not be aware that there's a compliance issue. So in the classroom, everything might be, do you know what I mean? But it might be rumbling from the data side, and then we need to go and sort that out and explain why. Something's obviously gone wrong somewhere. If it's on the teaching side, then that's something that the quality department would try and address, working with the compliance team.
Yeah, I've got some real examples of that I've seen over the last 24 months where there are some providers that have had glowing Ofsted responses, outstanding, but scratch beneath the surface and it's a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And you look at the Ofsted report and you're there going, this is not the organisation that I know from me reading it, because what I'm seeing is an administrative nightmare that's going on. And I think that depends in which sector it exists and how long you allow that to go on before it gets found out. And we've got to bear in mind that there are these regularity checks that take place, and it will get found out. It's not just in the year, it's over a period of 6 to 7 years that they can come and audit and look at things. So it's very important to take ownership of it from the top down and actually deal with the actual issue that's going on and make sure that everyone's working in synergy.
But the student experience could still be good, couldn't it? That's what I was trying to get up from the classroom point. The student experience, which is what we should be about, could still be really good. And that teacher might not be aware that, the lecturer, that something that's going on, it could be something compliance related to do with not funded correctly or the eligibility is wrong.
I think we don't make the connection of this enough, actually. We could probably do a whole conversation about this separately, is that I agree with you, in that immediate moment, it might not impact on what's happening in the room, and that, applies across every sector that you work in, not just the ones that we focus on. I think there's definitely something about, if you don't deal with it, at some point it will come to bear, about the impact of that, of what happens in the room. But I think for me, the connection we probably don't make often enough with compliance is, particularly when all of our budgets are squeezed in different ways at the moment, is the connection between compliance and efficiency. And actually, where I think it impacts on quality is that we might have more cash to do more with if we were more compliant sometimes. Because actually, if you're compliant to the processes of the organisation, for example, now, number one, you've got to have processes in place in order to be compliant with them. So for me, that's where I think there's probably a link with quality and compliance, that we're not able to make that link clearly enough.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like you think you're compliant until somebody tells you you're not. And then when you do have compliance issues, then you have to go back to the root of those processes. And are your processes efficient? And are people even following them in the first place to be able to gain that quality? And the processes are the starting point. To have compliant processes, then you can build up to a high quality standard, rather than trying to get high quality standard without having the basic processes in place.
My limited involvement and within the awarding organisations, and it's been fantastic to learn about that. And actually, some of the work that I've done with NCFE is the relationship and the crossover, if you like, exactly as Alisha describes, between compliance and quality is so much tighter. And so much cleaner, if you like, between, you just can't do one well without the other. So Jo, if we take as read, which I think we're all in agreement on, we need to embed a culture of compliance across the organisation. What steps do you think need to be taken for an organisation to embed that?
I think if we can share good practice with all the departments involved in what we're trying to accomplish, and everybody understands everybody else's roles to a certain extent, then that improves and we're able to embed that. Take main enrolment at summer, for example. The curriculum don't know what the data side do, what finance do fully, but we try and share all our roles and tell them why we're doing it, why we're collecting what we're collecting, and the reasons why. When they see a 6 or 7 page enrolment form for data collection, the curriculum are horrified, but when you explain why we're collecting it and why we need certain things, it all seems to fall into place, and it helps then us be compliant in that aspect. That's just a small aspect of it, but just giving an example, you sort of then begin to understand why you're doing that.
Yeah, that understanding bit is key, isn't it? And I wonder, Paul, what role leadership play in that?
Yeah, I think the notion of lead by example is a really important thing to note. You've got to believe in your product and what you're doing, and make sure that that's actually permeates from the top down. And, because if that's not there, then why are you doing anything? So if they're not invested in putting a compliance culture first, then why would anyone else need to be in that process? Is everything actually done from the top down in terms of your KPIs, your strategies, your board meetings, to your delivery teams, to all the other teams that go on? Is compliance embedded in everything that goes on so people understand it? And I revert back to the thing, we've gone a long way with things like safeguarding and health and safety. This is one of the ones that needs to be done next, and people need to take it as well.
There's a whole bunch of things that you can align it back to those KPIs. So I see that flow developing in my own mind, if you like, from how do you challenge leaders around the relevance of compliance to the mission and vision? How is that supported with the policies? Are the KPIs in place for the organisation, not just about funding compliance, because that's the one we get hit over the head with the most, but actually then being about those broader business goals? And I think that's a useful reflection point, hopefully, for people who are listening, in thinking whether or not they can see that join up between those things as they go through their organisation. So Alisha, let's talk about collaboration.
In NCFE, we all do very different roles, and part of the compliance team is to kind of have that wide net understanding of everything that's going on, but you can't do that without collaborating with the leaders of different areas, so that when you're bringing compliance recommendations and you're trying to implement change, you understand how that affects somebody else in the business. It's like building that relationship of, we're here to support, and we can only do that by sharing knowledge and experience, and by them giving us knowledge and experience, but also us giving them the knowledge and experience of what we're doing something for and why we're doing it and what consequences it could have.
Yeah, and Heather, if you think about, the universities have a wonderful thing with apprenticeships where you're having to navigate a lot of people, with apprenticeships being a very small part of what you actually do in reality. So sometimes it's really hard, I know, for it to fight for airtime. It's not dissimilar actually in a college. So how have you gone about building that we're in it together approach to the way that you deal with compliance?
They do listen. We're very fortunate. But I think what we've had to do is bring in systems where we can get real data, and we can see if there are any issues. We can see where we're doing really well. We can see where we need extra support. So I think for us, that's been the biggest, most complicated bit, is finding the right processes and systems to help our growth. It saves so much time, because if you have an issue, you can have 6 or 7 people from all the different areas trying to sort out what do we do in this particular situation with a student, and you'll have me saying, from a funding perspective, we need to do it this way, but from a validation point at the university, we need to do it another way. But having streamlined our processes and worked on getting it to where we are now, we sort of reduce those errors. But what we do need to do is say, like, here's the data, this is how much the revenue is, this is what the issues are. So I think the key for us is being able to have those regular meetings, but them to be confident in what we're saying. But I feel like when we did first start, it was quite tricky, sort of saying, getting the airtime, because we were so small. But as we're like now, I think, is it 12 million a year we bring in to the university? So we have to work smart, and we have to, like I think Paul said, with his way of working, where if you check everything as you go along, you don't have to go back and do checks. You're confident. So if the auditors are coming in, we're confident that we can go, yep, here's our data, here's our evidence packs.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time focusing, absolutely understandably, in the education sector on the experience, the quality of the teaching and learning. So that has to be, of course it does, the thing that rules what happens. If you're in the employability space, it's about the interaction between you and the person that's looking for a job in order to help them to move into employment. So we wrap the quality element of what we do around that very tightly. I think where we're not so good is how we apply that quality and business improvement model process to the wider organisation. So actually quality and compliance feeds across, as you say, Heather, the processes that exist right the way throughout the organisation. So actually there is consistency in the processes in business development. There is consistency in the processes in the way their HR do their role, so it's a broader thing than sometimes I think we end up down quite a narrow funnel of what we do. And what made me think of that was your really important point around occasionally they compete against each other. So a compliance process, you're all subject to loads of different regulators, not just one. So actually sometimes the regulatory requirement that's driving the compliance mandate, if you like, competes against each other. And that in itself drives inefficiency in what you do and frustration. Would that be fair to say in amongst the staffing base? So Paul, when you're thinking about that point around tools or frameworks that you put in place to help navigate that, what have you found works, or at least the things that you go to, if you like, in order to try and get that whole system approach?
So one of the things is I always think keep it simple, don't overthink it too much. It's like that's where it can be a problem. You don't have to create this whole process of what's going on. Take things in isolation and just go, right, what's the root cause issue here? What can we do to resolve it? Let's then fix it and move on to the next. It's like choose the battles that you're dealing with. There are tools out there that exist, and my bias is from a data perspective and from the individual learner record and what has to be accurate there.
For sure.
There's so many different learner management systems out there. Usually I get people saying, well, which one's best and which one's not. It's all personal choice. It really is. But one of the key things is you need to look at who is it aimed at? Are you aiming it at meeting a compliance need, which I think sometimes is not thought of enough? So it's like making sure you spend time to look at those things and really understand what they are, and then throw that back into your processes of how you can improve to be better moving forward.
I think it takes us back to is that really key point around you have to start with what do you stand for as an organisation and where compliance fits into that, and what are your KPIs before making purchase decisions about, because otherwise you end up buying systems, and I say this as a tech person, that where the system drives you rather than the other way around. Now to some extent there's an interplay with that. It's not as neat as it shouldn't, because actually you want it to bring new practice and structure into the organisation, but there's a risk if you get a jarring of the two, and I see that so often within providers. So Jo, if we take that to its next step, which is thinking about how you train and develop your people in a compliance culture. I'm a new person that's joining the organisation. What's your sense of what we need to do to make sure that those people feel well trained and well and knowledgeable? I think was the point that you made right back at the beginning, in order to be able to really feel like they own compliance on a day-to-day basis.
So in the data and compliance team, they would have a buddy when they started, and they'd work with a buddy. And I mean, there's 4 teams within the data team, but they all sort of work together. But everybody has the daily tasks, and they have that in the diary, so they know what they're doing. Start little, show them how to input an enrolment form, show them what they should be checking so that the system matches the paper, and then from once they've done that, run the first set of housekeeping reports and ask them to try and look at what might not be right, or can they see a pattern of something that's not right, or is the data right, and then move them along. But I think it's about them not being frightened to ask questions. If there's new funding guidance released, when we get to that stage, we all as a team discuss it, because there's different interpretations. I might interpret the eligibility some way, somebody else might interpret it another way, and we have that discussion, and even the new staff would. And then we do it with curriculum as well. So when we're at enrolment, if it was a new member of staff, we would talk to them and explain to them, what they needed to do. When we're validating the enrolment forms, we would ask them to come and sit with us. We'd explain that. If it's a new member of curriculum staff, we would ask them to come and do like a data induction and meet with exams and learn about registrations. Once the timetable's set up, we'd show them how to map the registers and things like that. So they're sort of cozied in and they're not frightened to ask, because I think there can be a culture of, don't go and see data, you'll have done something wrong.
That's what you only hear from me when we've done something bad.
Absolutely, it's very black and white, isn't it? And I think we're trying to sort of, well, I would like to think at EP&E we've got a good working relationship with curriculum and data. But I think as well, 4 years ago, probably the data team tended to work in silos and they didn't understand the full picture. So they were doing something, but they didn't understand why. It's about giving them from the start their understanding right the way through. So the whole student data journey.
As you were talking, Jo, I started thinking to myself, it's like, geez, I've been doing this for 25 years now. And I'm thinking what I was like when I started to what I am now. And it was like the first few years of me doing it, I was audit through and through. It was like, I would say that date's wrong. Go and fix it. You do it. I must have come across as one of the most arrogant people in history to do it. Whereas now I'm having conversations going, okay, well, let's try and see why the date's wrong. Yeah, let's try and understand what we can do to correct it moving forward. It's that attitude you do, and it's about the openness that you have with people.
Absolutely, working together.
There's a time where you do have to be that individual when they're not getting it. And it's like, no, enough's enough here. And you have HR processes for that, and you do it. And you have to use those tools to actually make use of it, because otherwise people are not going to get it. But I also realized that at a leadership point, the number of CEOs and managers that I talk to who we presume are specialists in everything. So, one of the things I do is say, right, let's go and have a virtual coffee break. You've got an hour to talk to me. Whatever you want to talk about, let's go through it. And they'll go through asking what they think is some of the most stupidest questions ever. But it's about them building their knowledge and taking that time out to do it, to actually inspire everyone else to do it. That's what I think a lot of leaders need to be doing moving forward.
Yeah, it's a really good point about the layering of how we develop people, and it not being, as you say, Joe, a one-off event. And it comes to mind if I use an apprenticeship example on a progress review. And I know immediately we've got a problem if the first slide on compliance is basically a stick that says we do this because the regulator says we have to, and you've lost them straight away on that. That doesn't put the fun in data protection. As Alisha said at the beginning, when the first thing you do is go, we're going to tell you, it's not our fault, it's what the regulator says. And of course, regulatory is a key element of it. But actually, you've lost the room as soon as that becomes the driving force behind it, rather than how does it link back to our success as an organisation? How does it link back to people making decisions about us being a great place, A, to work, or B, to do business with, in whatever guise, that business might come in.
NCFE have been on a massive journey in the last few years where we did start off in that siloed approach of you only hear from the compliance team if you've done something wrong. And that meant that people weren't telling us things that they should have been telling us, and we weren't catching risks and issues until they were a massive problem. And so we've worked really hard to build that relationship across the business, that we're not scary, we're not here to tell you off, we're here to support you, and you should use us, and you should use our knowledge and understanding of regulations to build a compliant model for the business, so that we do hear about the risks before they become a problem, and we can fix them, or we can put mitigations in place so that you feel confident that the things that you're doing are compliant. It builds that ability to grow and to understand what people are passionate about, and open up the floor for people to try new things. When they come to us and say, I really want to do this and I just want to double check that what I'm doing is okay, then you can have really interesting conversations with people, and you can hear people's thoughts and ideas that you wouldn't have heard of before because we were a bit too scary and nobody wanted to speak to us. But now that we speak to people and we're invested in what people are thinking about, we're innovative too, and we're really interested in what's going on, but not having that relationship and not knowing and understanding builds that sense of silo, and you don't get to celebrate the wins that other people. The biggest trend that I think everyone is seeing across the sectors, whether you're working in a award organisation or in education, it's AI. And I think AI is going to play a massive part in how compliance looks in the future. And we're already starting to see that in terms of what learners are using and the malpractice and maladministration investigations that we're getting around AI and how the business wants to use AI. And from a data protection perspective, it's quite scary what people are doing with AI and not understanding where their data is going or how somebody's handling their data. And I think that's going to be the biggest change, I think, in legislation and how people work in compliance in general in the future, is how quickly and how interestingly people use AI for different things. And yes, it's positive and it has really great efficiencies, but it has to be used in the right way. And I think we're still fresh learning, and that's the scary part, is kind of not knowing what AI can do and how people are using it.
Yeah, it's a great point. Well made. Thank you, Alisha. Heather, Joe, Paul, in that order. And you've got kind of one sentence to say. This is the one piece of advice I would give any leader in an organisation who really wants to think about how they might change their culture of compliance in terms of what they've got. So who wants to go first?
I think that leaders need to realise that it's about strategic priority. It's not just about regulatory obligations. They need
Beautiful.
to really think before they do.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Well made. Heather, you want to go next?
I think compliance ultimately leads to a better student experience. And if we keep that in the heart of what we do, then we can't go wrong.
Thank you, Heather. Last but not least, Joe.
I agree with what Heather and Paul have said. I think it does need to be given strategic attention. I think it is about the student experience, and I sometimes, and I'm probably going to take longer than a couple of seconds here, but I also think sometimes that leaders don't understand how long it takes for us to be compliant. And when they ask us something, they think it's a quick fix, and it isn't a quick fix, and it takes quite a long time. And I sometimes think, depending on how you asked for the data, if they don't understand what they're asking for, you could give them the wrong data. So it's about, when Paul said about them having sometimes a better understanding. As an example, somebody could ask me for how many 16 to 18 learners we've got, but they might think it's the continuing learners and not those past census. And sometimes you can provide the wrong information. So it's about people higher up understanding what they're asking for.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm going to come back in closing, but I've loved listening to you all today, by the way. And I'm going to say this on the recording, which I said off the recording, but nearly without exception, the compliance people are so interesting, because when I asked you to come on, a lot of you were quite reticent about being here because you're just not used to being there. And honestly, it's been, I hope you have found the experience not as horrific as you thought it might be.
Still got knots in my stomach, Louise.
No, yeah, maybe not hit the wine just yet, Joe, but tonight you get to hit the wine. Honestly, it's just been so lovely chatting to you all, and kind of you've made me think about some things that I need to think about as well, and think differently about as well. So I think the AI point that Alisha opened that last bit with, and Joe kind of finished with there, it is so crucial, because it's literally moving at a pace. You know, we're developing we have an Innovate UK grant for the development of AI within quality assurance, and literally by the day that what we can do is changing, how we can use it. But I think you make a really good point there, Joe, is that kind of applies whether it's AI or not, is our ability to ask great questions is at the root of, for me, quality and compliance. Because if we ask the wrong questions of our data and what we're doing, we end up in the wrong place. And perhaps there's something for us to think about in the way that we're approaching AI in prompt engineering, which is actually taking that back and just thinking about the quality of the questions that we ask of each other in terms of what we do. You know, your point, Nisha, about we're just nosy, really, aren't we? We're just really nosy people in a really good way, because we want to be nosy for a good reason. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I've loved seeing you all. Have a gorgeous week.
You too.
Thank you.